The late afternoon sun cast long golden rays over the small town of Ashton Hill. Nestled deep in the heart of Oregon, a cold wind rustled the drying leaves outside as the skies slowly darkened into a steel gray. Along the main street, most of the shops had already flipped their signs to closed, their interiors dim and lifeless, except for one. Callahan's bakery still glowed softly from within, its windows fogged from the warmth inside, and the scent of cinnamon and freshly baked bread drifting to the door every time it opened. Behind the counter, Mr. Callahan, a tall man in his early 60s with a crown of silver hair and permanent flour on his hands, was dusting powdered sugar over a batch of almond croissants. His eyes were heavy, but his hands moved with practiced precision, each motion a result of decades spent perfecting his craft. The bell above the entrance jingled, sharp and unexpected in the quiet. He looked up and froze for a second. Standing just inside the doorway was a boy no older than 9. His clothes were threadbare, 2 sizes too big, and his sneakers were more hole than shoe. The sleeves of his hoodie had been rolled back several times, revealing scrawny wrists red from the cold. Yet what struck Mr. Callahan most was the boy's face. Serious, calm, and determined not the face of someone there to beg. The boy stepped forward, stopping just shy of the glass counter that displayed neat rows of cookies, danishes, and a few remaining slices of chocolate cake. He pointed at a chocolate-glazed donut, sitting near the corner, his voice firm yet oddly polite. "I don't have any money," he said, eyes never leaving the donut, "but I can clean your floors if you let me have one of those." Mr. Callahan blinked, the sugar sifter still in his hand. For a moment, he didn't respond. Children came into his shop from time to time, usually noisy, sometimes whiny, often dragging their parent behind them, but none had ever made such a request. He stepped closer, leaning over the counter. "What's your name, kid?" "Ethan," the boy replied. Callahan studied him. "Where are your parents?" "At home," Ethan said, eyes flicking to the donut again. "But my mom's not feeling well." The baker glanced at the mop in the corner, then back to the boy. He was about to offer the donut freely. It was just one, and he'd throw it out at closing anyway. But the boy cut him off before the words left his mouth. "I want to earn it," Ethan said quickly, reading the baker's face. "I don't want charity." The firmness in his voice caught Callahan off guard. It wasn't arrogance. It was pride, the kind built through struggle and necessity, the kind that refused pity. Callahan rubbed the back of his neck. "All right, Ethan, deal's a deal. Mop's over there. Floor's yours." The boy nodded once and walked straight to the mop. He didn't fumble or hesitate. He wrung it out like he'd done it before and got to work, moving methodically from the front of the shop to back, sweeping the mop in practice strokes. He didn't complain once, even when the wind slipped into the door and made him shiver. He didn't even look up at the donut again. Callahan, watching from behind the counter, felt something twist in his chest. 10 minutes later, the floor was cleaner than it had been all day. "Good work," Callahan said, handing over the donut with a napkin. "Hope you like chocolate." Ethan took it with both hands. "Thank you, sir." Then he hesitated. "Can I come back tomorrow? I'll work again if you need." "You can," Callahan replied, surprised by his own eagerness to say yes. Ethan gave a small, tired smile, turned, and left the bakery, the donut carefully wrapped and held close like a prize. Callahan watched in the window as the boy walked quickly down the street, his small figure disappearing into the chilly evening mist, each step urgent but light, like he had somewhere very important to be. For a long moment, the baker stood there, arms crossed over his flour-covered apron, lost in thought. Something about the boy clung to him, his politeness, his insistence on working, that proud tilt of his chin despite his ragged clothes. This wasn't just a kid looking for a sweet. There was a reason Ethan wanted to earn that donut, a reason he wouldn't say, and something in the old baker's chest, some part of him that had long been quiet, whispered that it wasn't right to ignore it. He flipped the closed sign to face outward and stared again at the door through which Ethan had vanished. Tomorrow, when the boy came back, he would follow him, not to confront, not to accuse, just to know, because behind that quiet strength and those two thin shoulders, there was something unsaid, and Callahan couldn't pretend He did want to find out what it was. The next afternoon came cloaked in thick clouds and a biting wind that swept down the narrow streets of Ashton Hill. Mr. Callahan opened his bakery at the usual hour, set the bread to rise, filled the display cases, and stirred the batter for that day's muffins. But his hands moved out of habit more than intention. His mind wasn't on croissants or sourdough or the regulars who came by like clockwork. It was on a boy named Ethan and the look in his eyes, older than 9, but still far too young for the kind of pride that refused free kindness. He didn't have to wait long. At exactly 3:30, the doorbell jingled, and there he was again, same oversized hoodie, same calm expression, same backpack slung too low over his shoulders. He didn't say anything this time, just walked over to the mop, picked it up without a word, and began cleaning. Callahan watched him for a moment, then turned back to his register and busied himself with receipts he didn't really need to sort. When Ethan finished, he approached the counter. Callahan handed him another donut, this time with sprinkles. Ethan gave a quiet thank you, stuffed the treat gently into his backpack, and turned to leave. The baker waited until the door had closed and Ethan had disappeared down the sidewalk before moving. He untied his apron, hung it carefully on the hook behind the counter, and turned the open sign to closed, even though it was still early. Grabbing his coat, he stepped into the cold, locking the door behind him. His movements were deliberate, his steps measured as he kept a cautious distance behind the boy. Ethan walked briskly, his head tucked against the wind, his small form weaving to the thinning crowd of the late afternoon. He didn't stop to look into windows or kick pebbles along the way like most boys his age might. He just kept going, crossing into the older part of town where the sidewalks cracked and weeds pushed through fences. Callahan stayed a good half block behind, careful not to draw attention. The streets here looked forgotten. Abandoned cars, graffiti tag walls, and windows boarded up with uneven planks. The baker hadn't set foot in this part of town in years, not since it started falling apart, one foreclosed house at a time. But Ethan walked as if he belonged, as if the decay around him was as familiar as the smell of yeast and cinnamon was to Callahan. They turned a corner, and Callahan paused just out of sight as Ethan approached a crumbling apartment building with chipped bricks and a rusted fire escape, clinging precariously to its side. The boy didn't knock or ring. He pushed open the warped door and disappeared inside. The baker hesitated, then crossed the street and crept up the stoop, stopping just beside the entrance. From inside, he heard it, a soft, rasping voice. Feminine, weak. Ethan, you're back already. The boy's voice was clearer. Yeah, Mom, I brought something for you. It's a chocolate one this time. There was a pause and a quiet sound, part gasp, part sob. You didn't steal it, did you? No, Ethan said quickly. I worked for it again. You shouldn't have gone out in this cold. I told you. It's fine. I'm fine. Callahan took a slow step back, feeling as though he just intruded on something sacred. He glanced up at the building. 3 windows on the second floor were dark. The 4th glowed dimly with the flicker of a lamp through a narrow gap in the worn curtains. He saw the silhouette of a woman curled on a sagging couch, covered in several layers of blankets. Her head rested against a pillow as Ethan knelt beside her, unpacking his backpack carefully. Did you eat anything today? The boy asked. I had some crackers, she answered, though it sounded like a lie. I'll bring more tomorrow. Maybe something warm this time. Callahan's hand tightened around the railing. The air around him felt heavier now. This wasn't just poverty. This was isolation. A child trying to shield his mother from a world neither of them had the strength to fight alone. He stepped down from the stoop and walked back toward the main street, his coat flapping in the wind. The rest of that evening, the bakery felt colder, despite the ovens. He stayed open late, longer than usual, but not a single customer came. The town was quiet, the streets deserted. Yet his mind spun, each turn returning to the same place, that broken-down apartment and the boy who refused charity. The next day, Ethan came again. He mopped. He worked. He accepted the donut with a tired but grateful nod. And Callahan gave him more this time. Not just a treat, but a small paper bag with a sandwich and a cup of soup tucked inside. Ethan frowned. I didn't do extra work. Callahan waved him off. Leftovers. They'll go bad. Ethan hesitated, then took the bag silently. That small concession said more than any thank you ever could. The pattern repeated. Day after day, Ethan showed up at the same time. Callahan gave him small tasks. The boy cleaned, organized trays, even helped bag cookies. In return, he left each day with a little food and a treat. But he never lingered. He never stayed long. Always, he left before the sun dipped below the rooftops, disappearing down that same street, back to that same forgotten building. And every time, the weight on Callahan's chest grew heavier. One afternoon, when Ethan was in the back room sweeping flour off the storage shelves, a customer wandered in, a middle-aged woman, bundled in a wool coat, her breath fogging as she looked around the warm space. She noticed the boy, gave a small smile, then turned to Callahan. That your grandson? He shook his head. Just a helper. Cute kid. Looks a little thin, though. Callahan didn't respond, just offered a polite nod as he boxed her loaf of sourdough. But her words stayed with him long after she left. Thin. Yes, he noticed it too. And pale. And too quiet for someone that age. Later that week, as the storm approached, Callahan packed a bag before Ethan arrived. 2 sandwiches, a thermos of chicken soup, and a soft blanket he found in a back closet. When he handed it over, the boy's lips pressed into a line. I didn't do anything today. You showed up, Callahan said. Sometimes that's enough. Ethan nodded slowly. His eyes didn't leave the bag for several seconds. Then he looked up, met Callahan's gaze for the first time that week, and said, Thank you. The baker only gave a quiet grunt in reply. But that night, for the first time in years, he didn't lock up the shop feeling alone. And for the first time in just as long, he felt like his work mattered. Still, he knew this wasn't sustainable. The boy needed more than soup and sugar. And that mother, Lydia, needed far more than blankets and crackers. He couldn't pretend it wasn't his problem anymore. It was, and he would do something about it, even if he had to break the silence he'd lived in for far too long. Winter edged closer with each passing day, frosting the window panes of Callahan's bakery and painting the early mornings with a veil of ice that clung to rooftops and sidewalks. The town of Ashton Hill began to settle into its seasonal hush, with fewer people lingering outside and more seeking the comfort of warm drinks and familiar places. For Mr. Callahan, however, the cold was no longer just a sign of changing weather. It had come to symbolize the quiet suffering of a boy who continued to show up at his door every afternoon, mop in hand, with dignity pressed into every movement he made. Ethan's presence had become routine now, as steady as the ovens and the rhythm of kneading dough. But Callahan had learned to look closer. He noticed the way Ethan sometimes winced when lifting heavy trays, or the stiffness in his hands when gripping the mop handle too tightly. He saw how the boy sometimes blinked more than necessary, as if fighting off dizziness or fatigue, and how his eyes scanned the shop not out of curiosity, but caution, always calculating the time, the distance, the unspoken responsibilities waiting for him beyond the bakery walls. One quiet Thursday afternoon, as sleet whispered against the glass, Callahan decided it was time to ask, not to press, not to pry, but to understand the weight the boy carried. He waited until Ethan had finished wiping down the small table by the window and was folding the cloth with the same care he used every day. The bakery was empty, the usual hum of chatter replaced by the low drone of the heater and the scent of rising cinnamon rolls. Callahan leaned against the counter, arms crossed. Do you go to school, Ethan? The boy didn't look up right away. Most days. Teachers nice? Ethan shrugged. Some of them. They let me stay after to use the library computers. I do homework there. Callahan nodded slowly. Do they know about your mom? Ethan glanced up, guarded. Why? Because maybe they could help. You shouldn't have to. I'm not a charity case, Ethan said quickly, sharper than he intended. Then, softening, he added, Sorry, I don't want him to take her away. Callahan's brow furrowed. Who? My mom. If they find out she's sick and I'm taking care of stuff, they might think she's unfit. They might split us up. The baker exhaled quietly, the pieces beginning to fall into place. It wasn't just poverty that kept Ethan in motion. It was fear, a fear deeper than hunger, stronger than cold. The fear of being alone, of being separated from the only family he had left. Callahan nodded, understanding more than he let on. I won't tell anyone, but if there's anything I can do, I want to. Ethan didn't answer, but the tension in his shoulders eased just slightly. It was a small truce. Over the next several days, Callahan began to see more clearly. The bakery became not just a place for Ethan to work, but a quiet refuge. After finishing his tasks, he would sometimes sit at the window seat, sketching a notebook or reading an old library book from his backpack. Callahan started leaving out a small thermos of tea, and Ethan began accepting it without hesitation. Still, the boy never stayed past 5 o'clock. One evening, as a snow flurry blew through town, Callahan handed Ethan a thick woolen scarf. "Found in the back," he said. "Might keep you a bit warmer out there." Ethan hesitated, fingers brushing the soft fabric. "Thanks. I'll pay you back. I'll work more tomorrow." "You already did," Callahan replied. That night, the baker didn't go home after closing. Instead, he stayed at the counter with the old ledger open, the pages blank before him. His bakery had always been his world, a fortress of routine and memories, most of them tied to his late wife. Her handwriting still marked on old recipe cards, her favorite mug still tucked on a shelf. He closed himself off after her passing, burying himself in dough and silence. But now, there was a boy bringing color back into his days, one careful step at a time. The next morning, determined to do more, Callahan made a few quiet inquiries around town. He spoke with an old friend named Janet, a retired nurse who now volunteered at the local clinic. She knew the building where Ethan lived and remembered a patient named Lydia, a woman who'd once come in coughing badly but had stopped showing up. "She has chronic bronchitis," Janet explained. "Likely COPD. She was supposed to return for treatment, but she said she had no way to pay. She's not on any consistent meds, and with that damn apartment, it's a miracle she's still hanging on." Callahan didn't say much. He just nodded and asked if Janet could visit the apartment, discreetly. She agreed, her concern evident. That afternoon, when Ethan arrived, Callahan gave him a new set of tasks, organizing boxes in the storage room, restocking shelves. All the while, the baker checked the clock, waiting for Janet's message. Just before closing, it arrived. A single line. "She's in worse shape than I thought. Needs a hospital. Soon." The next day, Callahan approached Ethan differently. He didn't offer work or food. He simply sat across from him at the small table and said, "Your mom's not getting better, and I know someone who can help. Someone I trust." Ethan froze. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. "You follow me again?" "No," Callahan replied gently. "I just asked around. I wanted to help the right way. You can't just..." "I'm not calling anyone official. No one's come and take you away. I promise you that. But I had a friend check on her. She needs treatment. Ethan, the kind she can't get lying on that couch." For a long moment, the boy said nothing. Then he pushed his chair back and stood. "If she goes to the hospital, they'll ask questions." "Let them," Callahan said firmly, "because hiding isn't helping anymore. You're doing everything you can, Ethan, but some things you're not meant to carry alone." The boy's lip trembled, but he bit it hard, swallowing the storm rising inside him. Finally, he nodded once. "Okay, but I go with her." "You will?" And so, that evening, while the sky turned a deep navy and snow dusted the sidewalks, Mr. Callahan walked with Ethan back to the apartment. Janet was already there, speaking quietly with Lydia, who lay shivering beneath threadbare blankets. Her eyes fluttered open when she saw the baker. "You're the one from the shop," she whispered. "Yes," he replied, "and I'm going to help." Her eyes welled, and she took Ethan's hand. "You've been taking care of me all this time. Now someone's taking care of you." Ethan didn't speak, but his grip tightened around hers. That night, Lydia was transported to the local hospital, admitted under a temporary emergency program Janet arranged through an old connection. No paperwork, no investigation, just quiet compassion. Callahan stood with Ethan in the sterile hallway as the nurses settled his mother into a clean bed. The boy leaned against the wall, silent, a shadow of exhaustion under his eyes. Callahan placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone anymore, Ethan." And for the first time since their paths had crossed, the boy didn't pull away. It was the stillness of the hospital room that struck Mr. Callahan the most. Not the quiet of rest, but the kind that lingers between uncertainty and hope. Lydia lay on a narrow bed, propped up slightly by two thin pillows, her face pale and drawn. A clear tube delivered oxygen beneath her nose, and a heart monitor beeped steadily in the background. Her eyes fluttered open now and then, trying to remain present, but exhaustion pulled at her every second. Ethan sat beside her, his fingers wrapped tightly around her wrist as if willing strength into her veins. Though he didn't say much, he didn't leave her side. His loyalty was wordless, etched into his posture, into the stillness of his small body pressed into a plastic chair. Mr. Callahan stood at the doorway, unsure if his presence helped or intruded. He'd never seen himself as a savior. He was a baker, a man who lived in measured cups and quiet rituals. But something had shifted when he chose to step out of his shop and into this boy's life. What started as curiosity had grown into a responsibility he couldn't walk away from. Watching Ethan quietly adjust his mother's blanket or hand her a sip of water without prompting, the baker felt the weight of something old and familiar, a need to protect, not unlike what he once felt for the family he lost. Later that evening, after the nurses came in to check Lydia's vitals and coaxed Ethan into stepping out for a moment, Callahan walked him to the hospital cafeteria. It was mostly empty, its vending machines humming in the corner, casting dull reflections across the sterile floor. The boy didn't ask for anything, but Callahan bought him a grilled cheese sandwich and a carton of milk. Ethan took the meal without a word, eating slowly, mechanically. "She'll get better," Callahan said, not out of certainty, but out of a need to fill the space between them. "I don't know," Ethan murmured, staring at the sandwich. "She was better once. Then she got worse again. It always comes back." Callahan studied him. The boy wasn't asking for comfort. He was bracing for reality. It wasn't pessimism. It was experience. This wasn't the first time Lydia had slipped under the weight of her illness. "I've made some calls," the baker said. "There's a program in town. Community outreach, mostly for seniors and families in difficult situations. Quiet help. They can provide follow-up care, medication, maybe even a home visit nurse." Ethan looked up, suspicion flickering in his eyes. What do they want in return? Nothing. They just want people to stay alive. The boy didn't respond, but he nodded slowly, pushing the last bite of sandwich into his mouth. He chewed without looking up again. In the days that followed, Lydia's condition stabilized. The color returned to her cheeks in faint tones, and her voice grew less strained. She even managed a few small conversations with Callahan, thanking him in quiet words that carried more weight than any grand speech. But the hospital bed was never meant to be permanent. Within a week, plans were made to discharge her with medication and a nebulizer kit. Janet arranged for a volunteer nurse to visit the apartment twice a week, and food support would be delivered discreetly, no questions asked. Still, Callahan couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't enough. The apartment remained a problem, a damp, deteriorating space that would undo everything the hospital had done. But housing assistance would take months, and Lydia wasn't in a condition to wait through bureaucratic delays. That night, back in his bakery, Callahan stood in the middle of the kitchen long after closing, staring at the old storeroom behind the ovens. It had once been a second kitchen, back when the business was bigger, and he and his wife ran it side by side. Now it was filled with unused equipment, broken shelves, and dusty linens. But it had its own entrance, a small bathroom, and enough space for a bed and a dresser. An idea formed, not sudden, but rising steadily, like bread in a warm oven. He cleared the room the next day, spent hours scrubbing the floors, repainting the walls, moving out what was broken and cleaning what remained. He brought in a bed from the attic and a nightstand from his garage. He called a plumber to fix the sink and asked a carpenter to replace the broken window. He didn't say why. He just paid the bills and worked late into the night. By the end of the week, the room was warm, clean, and filled with the faint scent of lavender from the old soap his wife used to love. On a gray Tuesday morning, Callahan returned to the hospital with a quiet proposition. Ethan listened as he explained. Lydia stared at him in disbelief. "You want us to live in your bakery?" "Not in it. Just beside it," Callahan said. "The back room has a private entrance. It's not much, but it's dry and it's safe. You'd have food, heat, someone nearby, in case anything goes wrong." Lydia tried to protest. She wasn't used to accepting help. She, too, carried pride, but her body was too tired for arguments, and her son had already been carrying too much for too long. Ethan spoke before she could. "We'll take it." She looked at him, tears shining in her eyes, then at Callahan. "Why would you do this?" The baker's voice was quiet, steady. "Because someone once saved me, when I didn't think I could go on. Because I have space. And because your son reminded me what courage looks like." They moved in 2 days later. Lydia walked slowly, leaning on Ethan, as they stepped to the back entrance into their new temporary home. The air smelled of bread and warmth. Callahan had placed a vase of daisies on the nightstand. Fresh, delicate, simple. Ethan set down their bag and helped his mother onto the bed. She wept quietly into her hands, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming weight of relief. From that day forward, Ethan became a part of the bakery, not just as a helper, but as something more. Callahan gave him small responsibilities, taught him how to knead dough properly, how to measure ingredients without spilling, how to watch the rise of yeast like a living thing. The boy absorbed everything quickly, not with impatience, but with a hunger to understand. Some days, Lydia would sit at the back table with tea and a book, watching as her son moved between tasks. She smiled more now, laughed sometimes. Her cough remained, but softer. Her color improved. Her eyes were brighter. And the bakery changed too. Customers began to notice the difference. The once quiet shop now carried the sound of soft conversations, of youth in motion, of purpose shared. People lingered longer. Smiles came more easily. The warmth wasn't just from the ovens anymore. It came from something deeper, harder to describe but impossible to miss. Late one evening, Callahan stood in the kitchen, wiping down the counter as Ethan prepared the next morning's muffin trays. The boy moved confidently now, humming under his breath. "You're good at this," Callahan said. Ethan shrugged. "You taught me." Callahan smiled faintly. "Still, not everyone listens like you do." Ethan didn't answer, but a quiet pride settled his features. And for the first time in many years, Mr. Callahan felt something stir in his chest. Not grief, not guilt, but a deep and steady peace. He had found his way back to the world, through flour and fire, and a boy who once offered to work for candy. By the time spring pushed away the final frost from the sidewalks of Ashton Hill, the bakery on the corner of Main and Elm had transformed from a quiet neighborhood staple into something more alive. The scent of warm cinnamon and rising bread still filled the air each morning. But now, it was accompanied by something brighter. Voices, laughter, the gentle clatter of pans, and the shuffle of small feet moving with purpose. Mr. Callahan, once a figure of solitude wrapped in routine and silence, found himself surrounded by a rhythm he hadn't known he needed. And at the heart of that rhythm was Ethan. Every morning, Ethan woke early, got dressed in the dark, and tiptoed out of the small room he now shared with his recovering mother. Lydia, though still fragile, had found comfort in the steady safety of the bakery walls. With her medication regimen in place, regular check-ins from a nurse, and proper meals every day, her strength was returning piece by piece. Sometimes, she helped fold napkins at the back table or read quietly while watching Ethan learn. On better days, she would walk the corner and back, bundled in a coat too large for her frame, but smiling anyway. Mr. Callahan had given Ethan more responsibilities, not out of obligation, but because the boy had earned them. He now helped manage the early deliveries, restocked ingredients, and even assisted in prepping the dough for the first batch of morning pastries. Customers began to notice the boy's presence. At first, some were surprised, a child in the kitchen, but as they watched him work, with focus and care that rivaled adults twice his age, their doubts faded. He greeted them with quiet respect, sometimes remembering a regular's favorite scone or how a customer liked their coffee. The townspeople of Ashton Hill began to speak his name with fondness. Ethan wasn't just a boy who worked in the bakery. He had become part of its soul. But the real turning point came one afternoon when a teacher from the local school walked in to pick up an order for the faculty lounge. Mrs. Tinsley, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes softened by years in the classroom, recognized Ethan behind the counter and paused. "Ethan Hart?" she asked. He looked up from the register. "Yes, ma'am." She blinked. "We haven't seen you at school much lately." "I go in the mornings," he replied, his voice steady. "I come here after." She studied him for a moment, then looked at Callahan. "He's been helping you?" "He's more than help," Callahan replied, not missing a beat. "He's part of the team." Mrs. Tinsley nodded slowly, as if recalibrating her understanding. "He's always been bright, polite, just quiet." Ethan didn't respond, but he held her gaze with a calmness beyond his years. The teacher left soon after, but the encounter stirred something in Callahan. That evening, while Ethan swept flour from the tiles, the baker set down his notebook and spoke. "You ever think about doing more with this? Baking, I mean." Ethan looked up, puzzled. "Like what?" "Classes, workshops, teaching kids like you who want to learn. Maybe even starting something bigger." "I'm just a kid," Ethan said, half smiling. "So was I when I started. My father had a bakery. Taught me when I was younger than you. Said the world might change, but bread would always bring people together." Ethan returned to sweeping, slower now, thoughtful. "Would kids even want to come here?" "They would," Callahan said. "Some already do. The neighborhood isn't what it used to be. Too many kids have nothing to do after school. Too many families struggling. Maybe we can offer something steady." By the following week, the plan was already taking shape. Callahan contacted the community center and offered the bakery's kitchen twice a week in the afternoons. He would provide the ingredients and oversight. All they needed was interest. The flyers went up across town, hand-drawn with care, offering free baking lessons for kids at Callahan's bakery, open to anyone willing to learn. The response came quickly. On the first day, 4 children showed up. 2 boys and 2 girls, each curious, slightly nervous, their fingers twitching with anticipation as they were handed aprons and led to the long work table. Ethan stood beside them, not as a student, but as an assistant teacher. He demonstrated how to fold dough, how to sift flour without making a mess, how to measure sugar with precision. The kids watched him carefully, mirroring his movements, responding not just to what he said, but to the quiet confidence he carried. Word spread. The next week, there were 10 kids. The week after that, 15. What started as a simple outreach soon became a community movement. Parents came by to watch. Some offered to help. Others donated ingredients. The bakery, once a place for quick coffee and quiet conversation, became a hub of activity and learning. Laughter echoed in the kitchen. Flour dusted the air like snow, and tiny hands molded dough into imperfect but proud creations. One Saturday afternoon, as the bakery closed early for a private lesson with a group of children from the local shelter, Lydia stood beside Callahan by the counter, watching through the glass as Ethan helped a younger boy decorate a cookie. "You gave him something I never could," she said quietly. "No," Callahan replied. "I just gave him a place. Everything else was already in him." She turned to him then, her eyes misty. "You lost someone too, didn't you?" He nodded. "My wife, years ago. And you've been alone since?" "Until now." Their eyes met in silence, not heavy with sadness, but with a quiet understanding. In the presence of loss, they'd found purpose, and in that purpose, something close to healing. Later that evening, Ethan approached Callahan with a question. "Do you think one day I could run a bakery like this?" Callahan placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "I think one day you'll run one even better." As the sun dipped low over Ashton Hill and the last rays of light bathed the bakery in gold, the shop felt different than it ever had before. Not just warm, but whole. A place built not just with flour and butter, but with second chances, quiet courage, and the kind of love that asks for nothing in return. And in that moment, as Ethan swept the floor in his apron stitched with his name, and Lydia watched from her seat with a cup of tea in hand, Callahan realized something else. The boy who had once walked into his shop offering to work for a donut had given him more than he'd ever expected. He had given him back his life.